Welcome back indeed. Thanks for that very, very informative, provocative, open line and making points there about South Africa-China trade relations. We'll certainly revisit that question. In this segment, as indicated earlier, we want to look a bit closer to this question of South Africa's funding, not South Africa, but the funding of universities, government funding by universities, and the idea that Donald Trump seems to have launched a big campaign to cut funding from U.S. universities that have historically been the best in the world, and that particular status of being the best has been also supported by government funding. I'm joined by Johan LeBlanc, former senior U.S. congressional staffer, adjunct professor, national security law and U.S. foreign relations expert. Welcome to Power Talk, and thanks very much for making time and joining us. Johan?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be certainly a very interesting conversation as it sits at the intersection of constitutional law and federal funding and academic freedom in U.S. global leadership.
Certainly. Are you able to maybe immediately give us that brief background of the Trump administration's general attitude and towards the university funding, and maybe also generally to higher education, and if it's consistent, this attitude to his first term?
Well, first and foremost, I think that President Trump's present posture towards institutions of higher learning is a bit unusual in a sense that you have what you call the academic freedom, which is essentially the bedrock principle in American democracy, right?
Yeah.
And it is firmly protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And the U.S. Supreme Court has, for a very, very long time, recognized that academic freedom is indeed a special concern of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a number of Supreme Court cases where the court made it very clear that, shielding scholars and institutions from government intrusion into intellectual inquiry. So in this case here, you have Mr. Trump and institutions like Harvard and Columbia, where the state is actually pressing these institutions to take certain policy positions that these universities feel as though suppresses the notion of academic freedom. Mm-hmm. And this is how we got to where we are. In the case of Harvard, the administration had asked Harvard University to provide a list of students, international students in particular, among other things, by the way. This is just one of the things that were asked, to submit a list of students who were engaged in protest on college campus, especially international students, and who are protesting against the conflict between Israel and Palestine, to see if there have been any violations of the law in the process of protesting.
For the basic benefit of our listeners here at home, just a quick clarity on what the First Amendment is. It's not a very usual language this side. Normally, people say it's based on the First Amendment, and we always assume we are all understanding what that means.
The First Amendment is pretty much the freedom of speech. That's the very First Amendment within the U.S. Constitution.
I see. So when you say First Amendment, academic freedom is based on freedom of speech.
Correct.
I see. Okay, so how much then did the administration withdraw from universities, and then before we sort of zoom in on Harvard?
I'm so sorry. Could you please repeat the question?
How much of funding did Trump's administration cut or withdraw or stop? From the universities in general in the US, or is it just a special case of Harvard?
No, it's not a special case when it comes to Harvard. It's consistent across universities in the United States. As you know, the administration has undue many of the DEI policies. So, and many policies that provide funding to academic institutions to engage in research for a number of topics, like NIH, for example. It's a government entity that provides funding to academic institutions across America to engage in research, and obviously Harvard is one of those schools. I don't have an exact data as relates to how much money, but I can tell you the number has been very significant. But in the case of Harvard, for the fiscal year 2022, Harvard University received approximately $676 million in federal research funding, primarily through NIH, NSF, Department of Defense, and Department of Education. Now, I think it's important to note that Harvard University's endowment also exceeds $50 billion. However, Harvard still receives significant funding, annual funding in grants, student aid, and contracts from the federal government. So again, while Harvard receives $50 billion in endowment, it relies heavily on federal dollars to fund groundbreaking research, student aid, and global partnerships, right? So federal funding is not simply a gift to these universities, including Harvard. It's an investment in America's leadership in science, technology, and innovation.
In the whole world, yeah. But can you explain this caveat, this sort of nuance where the specific target in the main becomes foreign students or students that are not U.S. citizens on the one hand? Does that also follow on professors or academic staff that is not American? And is the idea that they must not, or are the implications or the consequences that they will lose scholarships, or in the case of academic staff, they will lose their jobs because of these cuts?
Well, in the case of student visa, right? Specifically when it comes to Harvard, Harvard enrolls roughly 5,000 international students from many countries across the world, and some will say Harvard admits students from more than 100 countries, right? Mm-hmm. You have visas, F1 visa, J1 visas, which are controlled by the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security. What I will say is that international students are a major pillar of U.S. higher education, contributing to over $40 billion annually to the U.S. economy. So any policies that restrict visas or politicize student access risk driving global talent elsewhere. And we've seen countries like China and a host of other countries have said, if you can't attend school in the United States, our doors are open, right? So essentially eroding America's global academic leadership. So while I do believe that it is very important to have strict vetting process in place to ensure that those who are admitted into the United States will not become a security threat to the homeland. But I think that national security, and I think that, of course, national security vetting is essential, but blanket decisions or political interference in visa decisions, I think, may send the wrong message to our allies, our partners, and the global academic community as a whole.
And what recourse does the university and the general scientific community have? Are you able, or are they able to approach courts of law in a way to compel the administration on its obligations to support higher education funding and research?
Well, certainly there's always room for litigation, right? Either individually or at the university level, where in this case we see that Harvard is actually suing the administration, right? Because of some of the administration's requests from Harvard, including requesting a list of international students at its university. And I think that Harvard stands on strong legal ground. Again, courts have, consistently ruled that the government cannot use federal funding as leverage to coerce, policy or viewpoint compliance from institutions, right? And you have, again, First Amendment, free speech, academic freedom. You have the First Amendment, due process, the Fifth Amendment, rather, which is due process. And you have administrative procedure law, which is arbitrary and capricious decision action by agencies, which Harvard has claimed in this case, saying that Trump's request from Harvard is arbitrary and capricious. And then, so the likelihood of Harvard prevailing is incredibly high. Again, especially if funding threats are clearly tied to ideological or political disputes.
Any other university, what have we seen from their own reactions? One of the big famous ones in the world with regards to these questions of cutting edge research is MIT, Yale, for instance. What have been demands from them, from the Trump administration? Is this demand for student records of foreign students involved in political activities, has that happened in those other countries? And might I add, if there's been an interrogation, for instance, of some of the research agendas to try and shift on the basis of you'll get funding if you change specific research objectives?
Absolutely. I think that Mr. Trump has used federal funding to academic institutions, to foreign nations, to various entities as a leverage and as a negotiation tool, right? And many of these institutions have folded. And we saw that even with major law firms here in the United States that have gotten their contracts with the federal government cut as a means to bring them to the table to negotiate with the administration. And they have all, if not most of them, have, in a sense, negotiated with the administration. But what we're seeing with Harvard is that Harvard is not backing down. And I think that Harvard is probably one of the best situated institutions in America to be able to take on this fight, and which, many people say this fight is a fight for America's First Amendment and for academic freedom to court, because Harvard does have the leverage. Harvard does have the financial backing. You're talking about an academic institution that has $50 billion in endowment. And some of Harvard's graduates have GDPs that are much greater than the GDPs, have money that are much more significant than the GDPs of many countries around this world. So Harvard, attracts some of the best and the brightest, some of the wealthiest students around the world, and has a very strong alumni base. So many academic institutions in America are saying the best institution to take on this case is actually Harvard. And if Harvard prevails, than to win for the entire academic community here in America and even abroad.
But is this normal? I mean, in U.S. history, has this happened before with any other administration? And if so, what did universities do to fight for academic freedom and institutional autonomy?
Well, I can't think of a time in history where it has been this severe all across the board. I may be wrong, but where we are currently in America is in terms of academic freedom, is something that is concerning to many academicians here in this country, because American universities are not just domestic institutions, as you know, right? I mean, they are essentially global platforms for knowledge diplomacy. So weakening academic freedom at home certainly undermines America's credibility when advocating for freedom of expression abroad. That's just a fact.
Certainly, and I imagine here as well that America's leading place in the world as the sort of capital of innovation, even in cutting research like AI, space science, and all of that, you kind of know that is the contribution of internationally renowned professors and academics and researchers that are not necessarily of U.S. citizenry. So what's the logic of trying to break that particular base? I mean, since the days of Einstein, he was not American. Coming this way, why would you break that tradition if you believe in America's dominance in the world? It doesn't make sense if I'm Trump.
No, I absolutely. I think that, as we discussed earlier, international students bring revenue and obviously talent to this country, and their innovation, their ingenuity, right? Many of some of the greatest minds and some of the greatest inventions that this country has benefited from came from foreign students, folks who came as students and ended up staying here in America and contributing to the development of America. And that's what has historically made America great, is their contribution, right? So if the U.S. politicizes higher education, many may choose Canada, Europe, China, right? South Africa, right? You have University of Cape Town, University of Pretoria, University of Wits, University of Stellenbosch, like incredible universities, right? Which would essentially weaken America's global intellectual leadership.
Speaking of that,
you're asking are very valid.
Yeah, speaking of that, I mean, the final aspect I want to sort of ask you about is these collaborative research initiatives that have to happen. I mean, science cannot be domesticated, as you know. So collaborative research, specifically around disease and many health, the health of human beings, as it were. Are these cuts targeted even at those programs?
NIH is a research institution. Yes, certainly. Some of these areas have received significant cuts as well. So universities like Harvard, which has a significant endowment, can always make up where the government lacks. But other universities that may not have such huge endowment may not be able to proceed with some of its research. And many universities across the nation have had to cut faculty, staff, because they don't have the necessary funding any longer, right? If the funding stops coming in, how do you pay these faculty, right, and these researchers? So the cuts have had significant implications, here in this country, and these implications will be felt, because as many of these researchers were researching, groundbreaking, remedies for diseases. There's one case where a woman was doing research on anti-aging, and she would stop at the airport, student visa, and was put in ICE detention for deportation, right? So there are many of these cases, but beyond that, many folks who are researchers in the academic space have been let go and have lost their jobs. So unless other institutions step in, like the Bill Gates Foundation and the alumni base and other private sector entities step in and say, hey, I will allocate a certain amount of money to academic institutions around the nation to continue on with these incredibly important research to address concerns like HIV and AIDS, cancer, Alzheimer's. I mean, you name it. We're going to have a real problem in this country for the next, not just the next 4 years, but for many, many years to come. So this is essentially a global health crisis that this country is dealing with at this current moment.
Joanne LeBlanc, adjunct professor, national security law expert, U.S. foreign policy and relations expert. Thank you deeply for creating time. I didn't ask, Prof, from which part of the U.S. are you speaking to us?
I live in Washington, D.C.
Oh, did we disrupt your peaceful sleep?
You certainly did.
Our sincere apologies and deepest appreciation that you managed to, to get off sleep to give us political and proper education about the U.S. Thanks deeply.